So pest controller bee removal is often done using a insecticidal type treatment. So that's one of the biggest differences with the types of bee removal that you can get. Okay, so pest controllers are qualified to use chemicals, and often that's something in their inventory that is used a lot in the UK, unfortunately. Bees are really important to the environment, so we would recommend that that should be a last resort for the pest controllers and for people who have actually got a bee problem. So environmentally, there's better options available out there. There's companies that do live bee removal, and there's also beekeepers, and we would recommend that you contact a beekeeper at least initially to see how they might be able to help and some advice there. But do be aware that beekeepers are experts in beekeeping. They're not necessarily experts in removing bees alive from buildings, because what now you've got is a building / bee removal experience that you need, not just how to look after the bees when they're in an artificial hive. So the beekeepers are a good first point of call, but do be careful and seek advice when it comes to actually extracting the bees from the building fabric itself, because the beekeepers might not be the best people to actually do that type of work for you. And of course, the other options available is obviously live bee removal. So I'd recommend that you try to seek non-lethal, more environmentally friendly solutions first before insecticidal treatment is even considered. When it comes to pest control bee removal, the treatments that are done have a whole raft of code of practice related to them. So for an example, if bees are to be treated, it shouldn't be done during the honey flow. So during the spring to summer months, bees shouldn't be sprayed anyway, because the honey caps in the honeycomb are open. Therefore, insecticide that's introduced to a hive actually contaminates the honey a lot easier. Whereas in the winter, the combs are capped off by wax, so the insecticide doesn't contaminate the combs as much as it would during the summer, and therefore there's not so many other stealing, foraging bees out there that will rob the honey out of the treated uncapped cells within the colony. Because remember, they'll actually fly that back to other wild colonies and beekeeper colonies, and that will contaminate those. Insecticide gets in the human food chain, and it also kills other wild bees and or the beekeeper bees as well. So another consideration is that on the code of practice, the bees are then meant to be sealed into the void space. Okay, so once it's been treated, hopefully at the right time of year, then the entrances to where the bees are going should be sealed, so no other foraging bees can go in and steal the honey. The problem with doing that is you're sealing in the honeycomb, okay, so it can end up dripping in the future. It will still be an attraction source for other bees, and often we find it's quite ineffective, because what will happen is the bees will sneak out from other entry points, maybe 3 meters down here or 6 meters over there. So sealing the entry point alone is not necessarily always effective. We've had a lot of situations where we've gone out and the bees have found another entry point, or indeed actually chewed through the silicone that was used to seal that entry point. So things like expanding foam, silicones, any building sealants are not going to be effective at stopping bees getting into the existing area they were colonising. So if the bees aren't sealed in and the honeycomb is then advised for it to be removed from the void space, the problem then you've got is it beggars a question whether the bees should have actually been removed alive anyway. Because if you're going to remove treated honeycomb from the void space, it may as well have just been removed alive without spraying them anyway, because you're still getting into that void space where the honeycomb is. You still got to take the building apart to extract the honeycomb. The only difference is that they're sprayed and they're all dead. And then you've got the problem of obviously then those contaminated combs being out in the wild. So instead of being in a contained area now, they're now being transported to landfill, or the dripping honey is going to end up on scaffold or on the floor, and indeed during the removal you might end up with foraging bees, if it's done at the wrong time of year, that might then start foraging on the spilt honey there. So that's a really important consideration, and if that type of treatment is done, the right chemicals need to be used, a professional needs to do it, they need to record the treatment, that's a legal requirement, they need to give you a treatment report to state what they've used, where they've used it, and how much of the chemical they've actually used. Then the consideration is what's happening to the honeycombs. The honeycombs, when they're bagged, should not go to landfill, they need to be incinerated, okay, so it doesn't contaminate other wild bees. So we got called out to a bee treatment that had been done. Client still had bees there. They'd had them for several years, and they just said, to be honest, we called someone up. They said, "Yep, this will solve it." They went out about 4 times to spray the colony. I think in the second year, the client said, "We've just had enough. We want them removed now." So we went over, and basically what had happened is the bees were going into a tiled roof, and where their bees had been sprayed, there was an attempt to seal the entry points that the bees were using, which was probably about 2 meters squared. So there's a 2 meter squared section of the roof where silicone was used, okay, to seal those gaps where the bees were seen to be going under. Now what was happening is the bees were just going into the next nearest gap that went underneath the tiles. So they're not silly bees, they will use other entry points to gain access into those areas again. So the cost of bee treatment would normally be somewhere between 150 quid to £600-700, depending on what the pest controller is quoted for. Obviously a wasp nest can range anywhere from 30 quid up to 150 quid alone. A bee treatment is exactly the same as a wasp nest treatment. The only difference is there's a code of practice into how the bees are treated. And this can be found on the British Pest Controllers Association's website, the BPCA. But do remember that bee treatment is often, from our experience, ineffective and doesn't normally solve the problem. Initially it might feel like it's doing something, but what you end up with is other foraging bees actually moving into that area or stealing the honey from the treated hive. If the bees were getting into the building, again, you just need to be really careful with using insecticide, because the insecticide can enter the living space of the property, especially if the bees have been getting inside, because if the bees are getting in, then a tiny dust particle that's used in the insecticide dust can also make its way into the building. So it's something just to be aware of and just be careful of that.